At the height of the Battle of the Atlantic, the ocean was a place of constant fear and uncertainty. German U-boats ruled the deep, striking without warning and disappearing just as quickly. Allied sailors learned to think of submarines as ghosts. Deadly, invisible, and almost impossible to corner. Encounters usually ended one way. Either the U-boat escaped beneath the waves, or the ship above was left burning and broken. Against that backdrop, the idea that a single Allied soldier could capture one of these submarines sounded less like history and more like fiction. Yet this moment began not with a grand plan, but with confusion. In the chaos of an engagement at sea, the U-boat surfaced unexpectedly. Smoke, spray, and noise blurred the line between opportunity and disaster. Normally, a surfaced submarine was still extremely dangerous, bristling with crew and weapons, and capable of diving again within moments. But something was wrong. The German crew was disorganized, possibly believing the fight was already lost or that their vessel was about to be destroyed. Seconds mattered. And in that narrow window, one Allied soldier made a decision that no manual or training exercise had ever prepared him for. Instead of pulling back or waiting for orders, he moved forward. Alone, with little more than instinct and resolve, he closed the distance to the U-boat. There was no guarantee of backup, no certainty that the crew would surrender, and no clear idea of what awaited him on the other side of the steel hull. Submarine warfare was supposed to be fought with depth charges and sonar, not boots on a slippery deck in the middle of the ocean. But hesitation would have meant losing the moment entirely. The submarine could dive, scuttle itself, or open fire. The opportunity would vanish as quickly as it had appeared. As he boarded the U-boat, the imbalance of the situation became painfully clear. He was stepping into enemy territory, surrounded by men who outnumbered him and knew the vessel intimately. The interior was cramped, dark, and filled with the smell of oil and metal. Every corridor and hatch represented a potential ambush. One wrong move could end everything in an instant. Yet the shock of his sudden presence worked in his favor. The German crew, already disoriented, was confronted with something they never expected. An enemy acting with such boldness that it defied logic. What followed was not a dramatic firefight, but a psychological collapse. Authority aboard a submarine depended on discipline and clarity. In that moment, both were gone. Faced with a single determined soldier who acted as if he already controlled the situation, the crew hesitated. That hesitation spread. Orders went unspoken. Weapons stayed lowered. In warfare, belief often matters as much as numbers. And for a brief, surreal stretch of time, the belief that resistance was useless took hold. By the time the reality of the situation fully set in, it was too late. Control of the submarine had shifted without the traditional exchange of fire. The U-boat, a weapon designed to terrorize entire convoys, had been neutralized by one man exploiting confusion and fear. The moment was so unlikely that even those involved struggled to process what had just happened. A submarine that should have been destroyed or escaped intact was now in Allied hands. The risks he took cannot be overstated. German submarines were often rigged to be scuttled to prevent capture. Booby traps, demolition charges, and emergency protocols were standard. Boarding one was a gamble with almost no margin for error. Every second spent inside increased the danger. Yet the gamble paid off, preserving not just the vessel, but whatever secrets it carried within its steel walls. That capture was more than a symbolic victory. U-boats were floating vaults of intelligence. Codebooks, navigation logs, patrol routes, and technical designs. Securing one intact offered insights that could save countless lives in future engagements. But in that moment, none of that was guaranteed. The only thing that mattered was that an impossible decision had been made, and it had worked. This was not heroism in the cinematic sense. There was no audience, no immediate recognition, and no certainty of survival. It was a raw, instinctive act that cut against everything the war at sea had taught both sides to expect. One soldier, facing overwhelming odds, acted before fear could catch up. And in doing so, rewrote what was thought possible in submarine warfare. And yet, despite its sheer improbability, this moment would soon fade into the background of history. Not because it didn't matter, but because its true value lay beneath the surface. Hidden in silence and secrecy, waiting to shape the war in ways no one would ever openly celebrate. What happened after the capture was almost as strange as the capture itself. In most wars, an achievement like that would have been turned into instant legend. Newspapers would have printed names and faces. Medals would have been awarded in public ceremonies. And the story would have been retold until it became part of national mythology. But this victory didn't follow that path. Instead, it quietly disappeared into files marked confidential, sealed away by decisions that had nothing to do with bravery and everything to do with secrecy. The reason was simple and incredibly important. The U-boat was more valuable as a secret than as a story. An intact submarine was a treasure trove of intelligence. Inside were clues to how the German Navy operated beneath the waves. Radio procedures, patrol patterns, mechanical layouts, and potentially even code material. Revealing how it had been captured risked telling the enemy exactly what had been compromised. If the Germans suspected that their submarine had fallen into Allied hands intact, they would change codes, alter tactics, and erase the advantage overnight. Silence became a strategic weapon. That silence extended to the soldier himself. His actions were acknowledged internally, but they were not broadcast. In official records, details were minimized or deliberately obscured. The focus shifted away from the individual and toward the intelligence gained, which was quietly fed into Allied anti-submarine operations. Convoys became harder targets. U-boats found themselves hunted more efficiently. Losses mounted on the German side, often without any clear explanation. From the outside, it looked like a gradual improvement in Allied tactics. In reality, part of that improvement traced back to one captured submarine and the man who made it possible. This kind of erasure was not unique. Wartime history is full of moments that were deliberately hidden because their true value depended on remaining unknown. Large battles could be public because their outcomes were obvious. Intelligence victories, especially those involving codes and technology, lived in the shadows. They won wars quietly, without parades or headlines. When the war ended, many of these stories remained classified for years, sometimes decades, and by the time they were declassified, public attention had moved on. There was also a broader pattern at work. History tends to favor scale. Armies, fleets, and famous commanders dominate narratives because they are easier to frame and remember. A single soldier acting alone doesn't fit neatly into that structure, especially when his success relied on a moment of chaos rather than a carefully planned operation. His story lacked the clean lines of a textbook victory. It was messy, improvised, and dependent on circumstances that could never be replicated. That made it harder to tell, and easier to forget. As time passed, the war's memory hardened into familiar landmarks. D-Day, Stalingrad, Midway, the fall of Berlin. Smaller but no less crucial events were pushed to the margins. The capture of the U-boat became a footnote, if it appeared at all. The soldier's name faded, preserved only in specialized records and the memories of those who understood what had really happened. For a long time, even historians struggled to piece together the full story, working around redactions and incomplete accounts. And yet, the impact of that single act endured. The Battle of the Atlantic was, at its core, a war of information. Knowing where submarines operated, how they communicated, and how they were built made the difference between survival and catastrophe for thousands of sailors. Every convoy that reached its destination safely because of improved intelligence carried an invisible debt to that moment of capture. The soldier never saw those ships. He never met the crews whose lives were saved. His contribution was abstract, spread across oceans and months of fighting. That distance made recognition even less likely. There was no single moment to point to and say, this is where it paid off. The victory was cumulative, unfolding quietly as Allied losses declined and German effectiveness waned. By the time the outcome of the Atlantic campaign was clear, the connection to that captured submarine had all but vanished from public awareness. Only much later, when records were opened and historians began to connect the dots, did the full significance come into view. What had looked like an isolated act of bravery was revealed as a turning point that fed directly into Allied success at sea. The soldier who boarded that U-boat alone had done more than capture an enemy vessel. He had altered the balance of a hidden war, one fought with signals, patterns, and knowledge rather than gunfire. His story remains a reminder of how history is shaped not only by massive operations, but by moments of courage that were never meant to be seen. Forgotten not because they were unimportant, but because they were too important to reveal at the time. These silent victories remind us that some of the most decisive acts of war leave the smallest footprints in memory.